So you already heard some heartbreaking stories from the front lines of the cryosphere crisis here. And today I'm going to give you a brief overview of the big picture of what the latest science is actually saying. So unfortunately, the big picture for glaciers globally is one of extensive loss. And this will have massive knock-on effects for the economic, energy, water, food security challenges faced by nations in the coming years. These graphs, as you can see now, show the percentage of glacier ice remaining under different temperature scenarios from now until the year 2300. Mountain glaciers globally are currently losing 300 billion tons of ice every single year. And even at 2 degrees, Europe will lose 80% of its glaciers by 2100, and the Hindu Kush will lose half of its glacier volume by the end of this century. If we continue on our current emissions pathway, will result in the extinction of nearly all glaciers worldwide before the year 2300. Now, these graphs are becoming a reality because countries are already losing all of their glaciers. Many of you will have seen in the news recently that Venezuela lost its very last glacier after a sharp decline, which you can see on the right of this slide here. Glaciers in the tropical Andes supply critical water to communities during dry seasons, so this ice really matters in terms of water security, as well as its cultural significance to local people. And the sad news is that many other countries will soon follow Venezuela in losing their glaciers. Indonesia will lose the last tropical glacier in Asia within the next 2 years. Germany and Mexico are on track to lose their last glaciers within the next 5 years, and Colombia, Ecuador, and several East African countries will lose theirs soon after that. But we have a choice still, and for glaciers, every fraction of a degree matters. Yes, some loss is already committed, but the outcome towards the end of this century is still to be decided. And you can see that from the difference between these two animations, our current emissions on the left, and the very low emissions pathway we can strive towards on the right. If we rapidly lower our CO2 emissions now, we can stabilize these ice losses. And if countries can keep global temperatures below 1.5 degrees, we can still save about half of the world's glacier ice, which will have enormous benefits for livelihoods, energy, water, food security of billions of people across the world. Now, we can't talk about snow and ice without discussing sea level rise, because this is already causing huge damage globally. And a recent example showed that the sea level rise caused by fossil fuel burning to date led to an extra $8 billion of damage from Hurricane Sandy. That's $8 billion of extra damage for one single event at today's 23 centimeters of sea level rise. So future sea level rise will be dominated by the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, which have undergone massive ice loss over the last 20 years. The 7 worst years of ice loss have all occurred in the last decade, and the current rates of loss observed in Greenland are currently tracking above even the worst case projections of the IPCC. Now, because of the melting of glaciers and ice sheets, irreversible sea level rise of at least 30 centimeters above today's levels is now locked in by 2070. And the latest science we have now clearly shows that the world will experience faster sea level rise at lower temperatures. And not only that, but only 1.5 degrees, not 2 degrees, in slow rates of sea level rise in the long term. But most concerningly of all, the dotted line you see on this graph from the IPCC, which was included in the 2021 assessment, despite being based on only 2 studies at the time, has been supported again and again by a growing weight of studies since, including one just published 2 days ago. And if our ice sheets begin to accelerate rapidly, we could see 1 meter of sea level rise by 2070, 3 meters in the early 2100s, and over 10 meters can't be ruled out by 2300. Now, we're all speaking as part of the London Climate Action Week, and London is massively vulnerable to even low amounts of sea level rise. So this map shows in red areas that would be inundated with just 1 meter greater than present. And that's why London has this, the Thames Barrier. It's now 40 years old and costs £2.4 billion in today's money to construct. These multi-billion-dollar infrastructure projects are what were deemed necessary to cope with the 23 centimeters of sea level rise we've now experienced since the start of the 20th century. But climate change is shifting the dials, and because losses from glaciers and ice sheets are accelerating, we now have to work out how to cope with sea level that is rising twice as fast as it used to, and could potentially experience a step change in acceleration in the future. Now, the Thames Barrier had to close 4 times in the 1980s. In the 1990s, it closed 35 times. In the 2000s and 2010s, it had to close 150 times. Now, the barrier was never designed to be used this frequently, and because of this, its tidal defences will have to be raised 15 years earlier than expected. But of course, some countries don't have the resources required to defend against this level of sea level rise. This is Calcutta under just 1 metre of sea level rise. This amount is now inevitable by the mid-2300s, but could occur by 2070 if current real-life emissions continue. At 3 metres, which could potentially occur as early as next century if emissions continue on their current path, this city will be gone. Karachi in Pakistan will also see extensive inundation, even at relatively low water levels. And these countries are often faced with the choice between fighting poverty or fighting climate change. And that is not a choice that any country should have to make. This is Dhaka in Bangladesh, home to 10 million people, just 1 metre of sea level rise. By 3 metres, this great city will become an island. But it's not just the least developed countries and small island states that will be affected by this problem. The G20 countries produced 80% of global emissions and will continue to have their economies, industries, and populations damaged by irreversible sea level rise for centuries unless they rapidly cut their emissions with an urgency we've never seen before. This is Shanghai at 1 metre and 3 metres. Miami at 1 and 3 metres. The EU, massively exposed to this risk at 1 metre. Tokyo, devastated at 1 metre, damaged beyond repair at 3. Brazil's Rio, it's at 1, massively impacted at 3. Now, these nations cannot shy away from the problem they have created through their relentless CO2 emissions, and they are now faced with a choice. Either we slow these impacts down to timescales of hundreds of years so that we can adapt, or we continue as we are, blowing past hard limits to adaptation and causing permanent loss and damage globally. This is a choice we're going to have to make in this decade under the watch of world leaders today. We know what has to be done, and that is credible emissions reductions targets for 2030 and 2035, and then the political will to make these emissions reductions a reality. The science is absolutely clear. Now we just need a visionary response in global action. Thank you. Everyone can make their own small impact, that's for sure. But one of the biggest impacts that individuals can make is voting for politicians and regimes that will actually put pressure on the global system to actually change. The G20, as we said earlier, contribute 80% of emissions right now, and that is really where the cuts have to happen. These countries have the ability to, they have the resources to, and they have the capability to have a transition here, which is actually beneficial to their economy, to their jobs, to their green energy systems. And so we need to put more pressure at the highest, very highest level to really push this forward and change radically based on the latest science. So what we're trying to do here is using what we're seeing in the mountains, using what we're seeing at the seas, using what the science is saying, but then getting politicians together, educating them about this, and then using that science to push as hard as we can for urgent emissions reductions now.